Welcome to the Binary Agora. I am your host, Alba Rivera Martinez. The EU just released the tech sovereignty package consisting of a revised Chips Act, the Cloud and AI Development Act, a strategy for an EU open digital ecosystem, and a strategic roadmap for digitalization and AI in energy. So, following the Draghi report, the EU remains, I would say, structurally reliant on non-EU providers for over 80% of its digital products, its services, its infrastructures, and also its intellectual property. And the package seeks to address this particular problem. And to discuss it, we have with us today Anselm Küsters, who's the scientific director for the Nordic countries and head of division for digitalization and AI at SEP. His work is mainly centered on evaluating EU digital regulation and developing SEP's presence in Scandinavia and the Baltics. Welcome to the Agora, Anselm.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you for joining us. And in your work, you frame sovereignty as a precondition for openness. This is a completely different standard from the Draghi style diagnosis of dependency. So when you say that this operating as a precondition for openness, what specific capacity or capacities are you pointing to?
Yeah, that's a great question to start actually, because this work you have been referring to is joint work with my colleagues at the Center for European Policy. And when we were thinking about how to react to this tech sovereignty package just published by the EU, the first question we had to ask, what is actually meant with sovereignty? And if you look in the literature, there are so many different definitions. We quickly discovered that German lawyers have a very specific way of thinking about sovereignty. Having read Carl Schmitt, economists mean something completely different on the other hand. So we try to find our own conception. And for us, really, the key sense of sovereignty is the capacity to act freely. And with that, we basically mean three different things: that you're able to negotiate and to choose based on your negotiations, and then finally to switch if you're no longer happy with what you have chosen in the first place. And if you cannot do those three things, we think you are not really sovereign in the digital sphere. Just to illustrate, like these three criteria, switching capacity, we mean with this the ability to move from one provider to another without ruinous costs. Of course, we don't want to overemphasize the point. There are always certain costs, at least in time, when you switch from one cloud provider, for instance, to the other. But it's just important that this is not ruinous cost, so that in some certain sense, it's doable. So not a complete lock-in. Secondly, you need some leverage in negotiations, both on the firm level, but I think also if you think about countries or region nowadays, and it's quite clear that Europe currently cannot negotiate on an even level with some US firms and maybe even the US administration from a position of strength, because the tech sector here is perceived as lagging. So that affects our negotiation position, and we have to be pragmatic about that. And then finally, in a legal sense, there's also this element of jurisdictional control. Of course, I'm referring here to the Cloud Act and all the problems that have been discussed with that. To sum it up, I think for Draghi, the framing is mainly one of a domestic resource gap. He acknowledges these dependencies that you also cited at the beginning, this 80% figure, with like the solution being we just need to build more on our own. And I think how I see it, and also my colleagues at CEP, is more like a structural problem. And that's the absence of alternatives. It doesn't matter so much, is it European or German or US? It's just, do you have monopolies or oligopolies or really complete competition? And that's our more structural framing, I would say.
And within this mix of words relating to the concept of sovereignty, actually the EU has really leaned on this notion since the 2020 European data strategy. So I wanted to ask you whether this concept has been sharpened by the package, or whether it has simply accumulated more policy content without becoming more precise as a concept.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, of course, the word is very prominent nowadays, much more compared to a few years ago, where it was mainly associated with the French discourse. Nowadays, it's also prominent outside Europe, by the way. So the US administration, the second Trump administration, also uses the term much more frequently than it used during its first administration. So this has to be acknowledged. But having said that, I still think this package is now the most specific attempt so far the EU has made. It really links this idea of sovereignty to really concrete elements like cloud classification tiers, and also this idea that we have to fund open source. And I think that's really progress compared to the data strategy that you referred to, that has been least in my sense, largely declaratory. So now it's getting a bit more precise. And I think what might be of interest to listeners is if I quickly describe these 4 sovereignty tiers that are made up in the package, because this is really to see how concrete it has become. One of the elements is the CADA, the Cloud and AI Development Act, and it defines 4 levels. Level 1 is that data must be stored in an EU data center. Here it's important to point out that US hyperscalers already meet this criterion. They all have EU-based data centers. So this, in a sense, is the lowest level. That is described by the Commission, and they estimate that it covers roughly 70% of public data. Going 1 level up, on level 2, the provider must also guarantee that no third country government can flip a remote kill switch or gain access. And with third country government, what they basically mean is US and China, to translate this. Again, here, all US hyperscalers can technically comply here. It's important to point this out. There are some legal gray zones, again, thinking about the Cloud Act, but in theory, this level 2 is also still achievable. Then level 3, the high security or sovereignty level, is that the cloud provider must be headquartered and controlled within the EU with European national staff. And here, there's some debate, as far as I can tell from like the last couple of days of public reaction to this package. I think initially it was meant that US hyperscalers cannot meet this criterion. But there seems to be also a certain loophole that the Commission grant equivalence decisions regarding a third country. So a bit similar like we have now with data protection. There might be later that they say, okay, we make an equivalence decision and US providers can actually fulfill this third level, which covers roughly 9% of public data. And then finally, only level 4. This is really full EU control of the entire stack, hardware to software. This is really only for EU providers, so no foreign ownership or influence whatsoever. And here it's really like this idea that effectively all non-EU providers are excluded, but this is really only 1% of public data, primarily defense, what the Commission thinks here about. So 1%. So I think it's important to keep these numbers a bit in mind, so not to think that these tiers suddenly mean all of our data has been shifted to non-European providers. It's really a very small portion. And as I have tried to already allude to in my description, you see it's somehow still fizzy. So it becomes more concrete with those hotels, but of course there are still a lot of debates, nitty-gritty details, what actually makes up those tiers. And I think these debates are here to stay over the next months.
In that sense, and going back to the practical side of policy, you have also written a recent paper on underappreciated trade-offs in EU digital policy, suggesting that the current discourse systematically avoids making explicit choices. So I wanted to ask you whether this package, does it make any principle trade-off a decision, for instance, between procurement preferences and competition, or between data localization and cloud market depth?
You're referring to work that is jointly co-authored with Cecilia Sotilotta. So I want to acknowledge her. It was great collaboration, and we try to describe these kind of implicit trade-offs that we often have in EU digital policy. And we also measure this empirically. And what we found is basically that this number of trade-offs is increasing, but the Commission is not really explicitly describing them and trying, in a sense, like to have the cake and eat it too. And I would say the tax sovereignty package really fits into this line. So no would be my honest answer. Again, it differs some of the hard choices. So the 4 sovereignty tiers I just described, they look like a decision, but they hand the real decision to member states who have to apply this, think about it. So it's again a certain deferral. And I would say it kind of continues this historical dilemma pattern we described in our paper. So you have a lot of distinct policy goals. You want to reach them all at the same time. Competitiveness, geopolitics, sovereignty, security, data protection, and so on and so on. So this is just another example, but that does not clearly resolve the tension. So there's still no clear legislation where that preference between mandatory and optional is to be made. And of course, you can also make a bigger point about industrial policy versus competition policy. In a sense, the Commission wants to have both at the moment.
In that sense, building on this idea of policy objectives being deferred to the member states, we must also add that member states might, on top of that, have their own policy objectives as opposed to the ones that the EU is thinking about. And also for any of the references that Anselm Anselm is making two papers and posts. I'm going to link them on the comments below. And going back to the idea of sovereignty and the relevance of having a narrow sense of what sovereignty entails, do you believe that the policy goals would be better served by really dropping this language of sovereignty altogether and working instead with narrower concepts such as critical infrastructure resilience, supply chain diversification, regulatory jurisdiction? So would that allow for more precise trade-off analysis, do you think?
I think you need both. In a sense, it's a politically functional terms, so it's important. But when we talk about the technical details, it's important then to use other concepts. When I think about it, it reminds me a lot of a paper I read as a PhD student. It was by a philosopher called W.B. Gully on essentially contested concepts. And with that, he meant a term whose very vagueness is part of its political function. And it reminds me a lot, and I think you could apply it also to this new idea of technological sovereignty. It's useful for building coalitions, but it's not so useful for writing legislation. So Gully, when he coined that term, essentially contested concepts in the 1950s, he had things in mind like democracy, justice, art, where you have really structural disagreement. So concepts where everyone intuitively say, that's great, democracy, great, tax sovereignty, that's great, let's have it. Everyone agrees the thing is good, but they're internally very complex because they have multiple components. And they're open to radically different weightings of these components. And that's often then not captured by the disputes, which is why people talk not really with each other. I think when we then talk about tax sovereignty, we have to disentangle these components that Gully means. I can see here several sub-problems in a sense. We are talking about infrastructure resilience. That's basically an engineering problem. We need more redundancy to cover failures, for instance, in certain IT infrastructure, uptime, and so on. We also talk about supply chain diversification. That's, in a sense, an industrial policy problem. If you want to plan, you can also say it's a bottom-up problem. The companies have themselves to adjust their supply chains. And then we have a regulatory problem, basically about jurisdiction, who can access data and under what law. And then finally, we also have all this geopolitical stuff, so autonomy, how to do foreign policy, intermingling of tech and digital policy with, for instance, NATO questions, what happens in a crisis. I think we really, at least as researchers, we have to disentangle these components. And that's ultimately only that will help the Commission to address them in a coherent way.
In your book, I think it's only available in German, right? Not in English. You have this book called Small is Beautiful 2.0, and you argue there that open source fosters not just innovation and competition, but also democratic resilience. So going back to resilience again, citing this ordoliberal lesson that democracy cannot function if economic power goes unchecked. On top of that, you also argue in favor of open source, federated platforms, and decentralized ecosystems. So the CADA, as you also remarked on earlier, proposes to triple EU data center capacity and mobilize around 200 billion euro in investment, largely challenged toward large operators. Within the tiers that you were describing, nothing would really hinder the hyperscalers from going through the door. So in a similar vein, the EU's sovereign chip ambition depends on a small number of very large industrial actors. So what would you say are the high-level principles that you would expect the package to finally introduce so as to maybe accommodate this small is beautiful vision, and whether do you think that this is possible at all, bearing in mind this first proposal?
Yeah, thanks for referring to my book. It's indeed published in German earlier this year with Herder, but if people are interested, there's an English summary on our Common Ground of Europe website by CEP, and I also have a weekly Substack newsletter for free called The Small Signal, which applies this Small is Beautiful framework to current tech news and technological developments. And if I apply this lens of small is beautiful now to the package, I would say it's an ambivalent creature. Yes, on the one hand, parts of the package, especially the CHIPS 2.0 Act, are written in a way that is clearly biased towards this belief in big solutions. Everything you mentioned perfectly fits the bill, 200 billion euro for data centers, this trend to AI gigafactories. Also, you need this very concentrated supply chain for chips. And I don't think it's necessarily wrong, but you have to make sure that when you implement it, it's not crowding out the decentralized ecosystem that we really need for resilience. In that sense, ambivalent creature, because the package actually has one really important element for the small is beautiful, which is its open source strategy. That's included. And I would say it's so far the most ambitious open source commitment I've ever seen from the EU. It's clearly influenced by this idea that open source will help us in Europe building up resilience. So I think this is really promising. Going beyond these AI gigafactories and massive data center investments, I think it's really interesting that they also include the promotion of open source component in the Cloud and in AI Development Act. They also cite the EU Digital Identity Wallet as an example with an open source mandate. And they also include a very interesting metric, namely this target of having 30 million active users of open source collaboration tools by 2030. So that's something we can measure. We can go back to in a couple of years and say, do we really have these 30 million active users? We can use this to really see, is this open source dimension put to practice? A key point will be this idea of supporting maintenance. So not just to give some money to initiating projects, but really make sure that they can be maintained over their life cycle. I think this will be really important for putting this vision into practice. So some of the large-scale investments, they are politically necessary, maybe even economically necessary. I'm not debating that, but I think it's important to reflect also on this other side of the coin in the package, which is open source.
You're still working on how to assess and how to meter this technology package, but in your initial assessment that I'll also include in comments, you argue that Europe must be competitive on the basis of the quality of its technologies and not by exclusion of other non-European technologies. So what would you say that is the most important policy intervention if the goal is the genuine quality-based competitiveness in digital infrastructure over the next, say, decade?
Really open source, not procurement preferences, but open source, and importantly, both open source software, but also open source hardware. There's both dimensions to this, which is often forgotten. And at least in my initial assessment, I think a lot focuses here on open source software. So I would reiterate, don't forget the hardware aspect. Open code, open standards, and the money to buy them is really the single lever I think that makes a difference. Why do I think so? Because it structurally reduces switching costs. Referring back to my very first answer, you remember when I defined sovereignty as having the opportunity to switch. So it helps against vendor lock-in. It creates a shared infrastructure on which European small firms can build and startups can build. So it also helps us to get a more decentralized market space in the midterm. It allows for competition because the code is auditable, forkable. It also reduces, by the way, security risks. Now, in the past couple of weeks, many people have talked about Anthropic's Claude Mythos model and saying, okay, it's so powerful. And this is really showing why it's not good to have open models. And I think, especially because this is the debate we have now, it's important to point out there's a lot of good research showing that actually, it reduces security risk if you have an open source structure because there's broader scrutiny. It's also called Linus law. Given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. It's really helpful from the security aspect that is really important nowadays with all these geopolitical tensions. Looking at it from this angle, I think the most important point here is to make that the funding gap is still a bit too broad. Currently, the package names €2 billion over 7 years. And at the same time, the goal is to reduce reliance on €264 billion in annual proprietary IT spending. That's the Commission's own figures. And they want to reduce that with 2 billion for open source. I think that's not enough. They should commit more, especially for the open source maintenance instrument. There's a good feasibility study that estimated this instrument alone would need at least €350 million to work. I think the European Competitiveness Fund, which is currently being negotiated, could be brought in here because it has a proposed budget. This is much larger. And we really should use also that budget to help with the open source component of the package.
So the bottom line would be more spending, open source, and stay within the liberal lesson that democracy cannot function if economic power goes unchecked. Thank you so much, Anselm, for all of your ideas, your insights on this really topical subject. I know that this was really last minute, so thank you for joining us here in the Agora, and I hope to see you soon.
Thanks very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.